My name is Mark Roberts, and like my subject this evening, Horace Mann, I was at my post in Florence for well over 40 years. Well, that's enough of an introduction, as I have a lot to get through. Now, welcome to the 18th century. In March 17, excuse me, it's not moving on. In March 1739, Thomas Gray and Horace Walpole set out from England together on their grand tour, aged 23 and 22 respectively. They had been close friends at Eton and Cambridge, but their personalities were completely different. And indeed, their tour ended in recrimination and bitterness. Horace was the youngest son of the Prime Minister, Sir Robert Walpole, and was very rich and spoilt and frivolous. Thomas Gray, the future poet, who would be best known for his celebrated elegy written in a country churchyard, was more studious and solemn, and was well aware that his expenses were being paid by Horace's father. They spent about 9 months in France and Switzerland before crossing the Alps. Such uncouth rocks and such uncomely inhabitants, noted Horace. And they proceeded via Parma and Bologna to Florence. When they arrived here, they were most warmly greeted by the acting British resident at the Grand Ducal Court, Horace Mann, who was especially friendly to them because he owed his post to Horace Walpole's father, Sir Robert, though in fact, Horace Mann was an outstandingly generous and hospitable person, as we shall see. The very next evening, Mann presented them at an assembly of the Prince de Craon, regent for the Grand Duke. Craon was head of the Regency Council, and at this time, the Tuscan court swarmed with Lorrainers. The ruler of Tuscany was Franz Stephan, the German-speaking Duke of Lorraine, who had become Francesco II of Tuscany when the last Medici Grand Duke, the dissolute and childless Giamgastone, died in 1737, 2 years before Walpole and Gray arrived in Florence. Franz Stephan and his wife, Maria Theresa, stayed in the city for only 3 months before decamping for good to Vienna, leaving Tuscany in the hands of a council of regency, so that all his Florentine subjects got to see of their sovereign was his statue, prancing on a horse on top of the triumphal gateway, which is now in what is now Piazza della Libertà. Perhaps not many people know that the great and beautiful Maria Theresa was once Grand Duchess of Tuscany. Now, to return to Walpole and Gray, both tourists were delighted by the acting British resident's friendliness and charm, and Gray called him the best and most obliging person in the world. They spent their mornings exploring the streets, the churches, and especially the paintings assembled in the Palazzo Pitti and the wonderful collection of sculptures in the famous gallery, i.e. the Uffizi. Gray studied the art in considerable detail and filled copious notebooks, whereas Walpole could not really be bothered with sightseeing and was far more interested in socializing. He was becoming weary of the splendors of the past. I see several things that pleased me greatly, he wrote to his friend Richard West, but I have left off screaming, Lord this and Lord that. To speak sincerely, Calais surprised me more than anything I have seen since. Yet Horace was delighted by the Florentine Carnival early in 1740. I have done nothing but slip out of my domino into bed and out of bed into my domino. The end of the carnival is frantic bacchanalian. All the mornings one makes parties to the shops and coffee houses, and all the evenings to the operas and balls. Then I have danced, good gods, how I have danced. He said he was fond of Florence to a degree. 'Tis infinitely the most agreeable of all the places I have seen since London. When the blind Florentine Pope Clement XII died in February, Walpole and Gray immediately set out for Rome in order to enjoy the ceremonies of the conclave. However, the cardinals took far too long to elect Clement's successor, so the pair of them decided, after a short visit to Naples, to come back to Florence. They settled into Horace Mann's guest house on the south side of the river, upstream of the Ponte Vecchio, the Casa Ambrogi, from the window of which it was apparently possible to fish in the Arno. As they would have known, Pliny the Younger was able to fish out of the window of his villa on the shores of Lake Como in the 1st century AD. Again, Mann was very agreeable. The climate was perfect. The summer days and nights drifted by in happy idleness. I am lodged, Walpole wrote, with Mr. Mann, the best of creatures. I have a terrace all to myself with an open gallery on the Arno. Florence, Gray told Richard West, was an excellent place to employ all one's animal sensations in, but utterly contrary to one's rational powers. He was happy to accept the style of life that Horace found so agreeable. Here you shall get up at 12 o'clock, breakfast till 3, dine till 5, sleep till 6, drink cooling liquors till 8, go to the bridge at 10, sup till 2, and so sleep till 12 again. Walpole became the Cicisbeo, or Cavaliere Servente, of Elisabetta Caponi, wife of the Marchese Grifoni, one of the most beautiful women in Florence, and she presented him with a lapdog called Patapon. He enjoyed himself a good deal. Instead of being in the gallery every morning, we are in all the idleness and amusements of the town. He became good friends with the regents, the Prince and Princess de Craon, and often visited their town house, Palazzo Crocetta, and their country house, Villa La Petraia. In August, the cardinals elected the affable and amusing Prospero Lambertini of Bologna as Pope Benedict XIV. Gray made a collection of musical manuscripts and began composing some Latin hexameters, but he too was having a good time, as he enjoyed watching the stream of life that flowed through the halls and salons of the palazzi along the charming bridge, as he called it, the Ponte Santa Trinita, where everyone used to meet in the warm summer nights. All good things come to an end, and it was soon time to go home. Shortly after leaving Florence, Walpole and Gray quarreled, and they parted in anger. Gray seems to have been the touchier of the two, and he declined a reconciliation. They made their separate ways back to England. Well, I wanted to start with these two, Gray and Walpole, because they're highly representative of the kind of grand tourists whom Mann was always helping, and because one of them became Mann's principal correspondent. Horace Walpole and Horace Mann never saw one another again, but they continued writing to each other for over 40 years. Now, to begin at the beginning. Horace Mann was born in 1706. His first visit to Italy was on account of his health in the years 1732 to 3. So dim was the view of his chances of survival that he brought his own coffin with him on the journey. He was always rather a hypochondriac, or at any rate a valetudinarian. Luckily, he did survive this initial brush with Italy and in fact made some useful contacts. 5 years later, he was back again in Florence this time, where in 1738, he became the assistant to Charles Fane, at that time envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary at the Tuscan court, whose duties he effectively took over. The Honourable Charles Fane was a very lazy and rather highly strung person, and was said to have taken to his bed for 6 weeks after the Duke of Newcastle, in one of his letters, forgot to sign himself your very humble servant, as usual, and then he put your humble servant. Horace Mann, on the other hand, was universally admired for his pleasant manners and accommodating nature. His kindness was generally acknowledged, perhaps most admiringly by John Boyle, 5th Earl of Cork and Orrery. He does honor to our nation. He lives elegantly and generously. He never fails in any point of civility and kindness to his countrymen. The politeness of his manners and the prudence of his conduct are shining examples both to the Britons and Italians. He is the only person I have ever known whom all Englishmen agree in praising. He has the art of conquering our prejudices and taming our fierceness. On the Italian side, Filippo Mazzei paid tribute to l'eccellente carattere del detto signor Orazio Mann and referred to Mann's cuore angelico, and said he was incapace di mentire volontariamente, which is all the more convincing as Mazzei was a supporter of the American colonists, and at the time of writing was on the opposite side from Mann in the War of Independence. The amorous adventurer and libertine Giacomo Casanova described Mann as l'idole de Florence, homme fort riche, aimable quoique anglais, plein d'esprit et de goût et grand amateur des arts. Mann would have been startled to hear himself described as very rich, since he was always complaining about his salary being in arrears and of a general shortage of funds. The girl lying on her tummy is Louise O'Morphy, a mistress of Louis XV, whom Casanova, in his memoirs, claimed to have introduced to the French king. Another typical tribute is provided by the second Earl Fitzwilliam. This is a portrait of Mann. The civilities of Sir Horace are amazing. There is never any assembly or amusement anywhere that he does not inform us of and carry us to. Sir Horace himself contributes more to the life of this place than all the Florentines put together. He has constantly a great assembly once a week at his house, to which everybody comes. And now in this season, his garden is illuminated like Vauxhall and is the prettiest thing in the world. Vauxhall Gardens was a well-known pleasure park in London. It was in Kennington on the south bank of the Thames, and it lasted from the mid-17th to the mid-19th century. Speaking of his own garden in Via Santo Spirito, Mann says, "The garden is lighted up very prettily with such lamps as you have in Vauxhall, which are suspended on green poles surrounded by vine branches." Mann allowed his English spongers to sit around all morning in his house reading the newspapers, and he entertained most lavishly. His official residence was the Casa Manetti on the south side of Via Santo Spirito. But as we have seen, he had another house on the same side of the river, known as the Casa Ambrogi, where he quite often put up his English friends. Now, I've said that Horace Walpole left Florence in May 1741 and never saw Horace Mann again, though they continued to write to each other for over 4 decades on a scale truly phenomenal and, as Walpole remarked, not to be paralleled in the history of the post office. The Dictionary of National Biography speculates that Walpole's hold over Mann was perhaps sexual, but in the absence of any evidence, we cannot really say whether this was true or not. Walpole's brilliantly witty letters are among the finest in the English language, though unfortunately the same cannot be said for Mann's. A modern writer comments that while Mann has many amusing things to say, he's very seldom witty. And here is an example of his labored sense of humor. On 21st of May, 1743, he wrote to Walpole, "Tomorrow is my general post day, and yet I am to have company at day, nay, the whole day, to see a great function from my garden windows. You'll not guess what it can be, so I'll tell you. In the beginning of the winter, an old, noisy, and very troublesome neighbor of mine died of a crack constitution, of which I and all my neighbors rejoiced much, not foreseeing that his apartment would be filled by a much more troublesome guest, for so it is that the newcomer, though very young, is of monstrous size and is to be, etc. In short, a new bell is to be hung up, 50 pounds bigger than his predecessor." Evidently, he's talking about the Campanile of Santo Spirito, which backs onto the Frescobaldi garden. "The christening is to be performed with great ceremony, for which preparations are making in my neighbor's garden, with many engines to raise him." And no doubt the new bell was blessed by Francesco Gaetano Incontri, the Archbishop of Florence. So as to leave no stone unturned, your lecturer spoke to the priests at Santo Spirito and tried to discover whether a new bell was indeed installed on that May morning in 1743. But unfortunately, nobody knew anything about it. And the books that they kindly showed me were no use at all. Now, this is where the Casa Manetti was. On the south side, to the south of it, you can see Mann's garden, which is adjacent to the Frescobaldi one. This is his house, and this is his garden. The modern street numbers on this house are 23 and 25. Above the right-hand doorway, number 25, you can still see the Manetti coat of arms. The house that is now number 27 was apparently also known as Casa Manetti, and it appears that Mann lived in both of them. In this house, there is a fine large room on the piano nobile, from the windows of which you can see down Via dei Geppi and across the Arno to the Palazzo Corsini. It's the only house on the south side of Via Santo Spirito with a view of the river. It was in one or other of these houses that Horace Mann used to give his celebrated parties or conversazioni. Here's the description of one of them by the Scottish consul and Freemason Alexander Drummond. All the apartments on the ground floor, which is elegantly furnished, were lit up, and the garden was a little epitome of Vauxhall. These little conversazioni resemble our card assemblies, and this one was remarkably brilliant, for all the married ladies of fashion in Florence were there. Mann's official duties in Florence were not really very onerous. He was supposed to liaise with the British fleet in the Mediterranean and to promote the interests of the English merchants at Leghorn, as Livorno was then called by the British. His most important task, and certainly in his own opinion, was to keep an eye on the movements of the family of the old pretender, James Edward Stuart, in Rome. During the run-up to the Jacobite rebellion of the 45, Mann issued several panicky false alarms to the effect that the young pretender, Charles Edward Stuart, or Bonnie Prince Charlie, had left Rome and was on his way north to invade England via Scotland. Then, when Charles really did leave, Mann failed to notice. And it's said that he never really recovered from the shock of losing sight of the young man, as he called him. What happened next was that Charles led the rebel Jacobite army as far south as Derby, less than 150 miles from London, before turning back and suffering a disastrous military defeat at Culloden. There, his brave but ill-equipped Highland warriors were cut to pieces by the disciplined Hanoverian troops of the Duke of Cumberland, known as the Bloody Butcher. Charles spent months in hiding, protected by the glamorous 24-year-old Flora MacDonald, and by dozens of unnamed Scots, none of whom was tempted by the colossal reward offered to anyone who would betray him into the hands of the English. He evaded capture and was taken to the continent by a French frigate. By 1751, there were so many Englishmen in Florence that Mann said he was thinking of taking a villa outside the city. But I am afraid of its becoming a cheesecake house for all the English. We have a larger flight of woodcocks than has been seen for many years past, nearly 30 staring boys. He complained about the crowds of English who spoiled his enjoyment of the season, but he made an exception in favor of a pair of grand tourists, Messrs. Pelham and Milbank, to whom he took greatly. We have lived in the greatest intimacy. The former is a very good-natured little man. The latter has all the good qualities one would always wish to find in anyone, and both have great partiality for me. I shall miss them extremely. They were commonly both, but particularly Milbank, of all my gentle riding parties. I called him my cavallerizzo maggiore, as he is vastly clever at all manly exercises and totally directed my scuderia. In short, I don't know a more deserving young creature. But Horace Mann could be fairly snobbish. Few English tourists, he wrote, are ever worth mentioning, except for their absurdities. He mentioned the Lady Orford, who took various lovers at Florence after her husband's death and returned to England, married, separated, came back to Florence again, where she became decorous and lived on the hill of Fiesole for many years, remembering a youth of excessive frailties. He mentioned young Lord Plymouth, the most sweet temper and fat body I ever knew, immovable before he is 30. This is another fat 18th century person, Daniel Lambert, who is kindly standing in for the 5th Earl of Plymouth, because I couldn't find a picture of him. He mentioned Lord Archibald Hamilton, who lives in the woods of Tuscany. He is a wild boy. In his letters to Walpole, Mann occasionally complains about his English spongers, the 100 who only come to scramble for sherbets and to pocket the glasses. And he describes his own somewhat odd daily routine. He rose at 7:30, ate 4 or 5 ounces of lamb's brains, then some soup and some stewed peaches. He went back to bed at 2:30 in the afternoon, and at about 6:30, I drink tea for the sake of the bread and butter I eat with it. I receive company in the garden and am famous for the best lemonade in Florence. Well, this is one of the beautiful citrus still lifes by the fruit painter Bartolomeo Bimbi, now at Poggio a Caiano. In 1755, Mann was created a baronet, having succeeded his elder brother in the estate at Linton. That year, the caricaturist Thomas Patch, 1725 to 1782, arrived rather hurriedly from Rome, where he had been studying at the French Academy until he was involved in a homosexual scandal and set himself up in a few rooms in the Via Santo Spirito on the north side of the street, opposite the Casa Manetti, the present day number 30. In an etching, he rather oddly shows his own head attached to the body of an ox. Grand Ducal Tuscany provided a more liberal atmosphere than did Papal Rome, or for that matter, than Protestant England. Patch's friendship with Sir Horace earned him plenty of commissions from English tourists, as he was quite a competent landscape painter. But he is best remembered for his caricatures, for his views of erupting volcanoes, and for the engravings he made after Masaccio. This large composition is called the Golden Asses, and it's now in the Lewis Walpole Library at Yale University. That's a Walpole library that was endowed and funded by a Mr. and Mrs. Lewis. In July 1758, the cardinals elected Carlo della Torre Rezzonico of Venice as Pope Clement XIII. He was rather less enlightened and more reactionary than his predecessor had been. This is a portrait by Anton Raphael Mengs. Although Horace Mann patronized the publication of Michelangelo Gianetti's Elogio di Capitano Cook, he never seems to have thought that he ought to be promoting English studies, despite the strong and growing Italian interest in England and the English. In fact, as Brian Maloney points out, he appears to have been out of touch with this element in Florentine culture. And although he had many contacts among the aristocracy, he seems to have had few among the Illuministi. He was hardly aware of their keen interest in such matters as the English judicial system. It's interesting to note his reaction to the scandalous case of Lord Ferrers in 1760. In that year, Lawrence Shirley, Earl Ferrers and Viscount Tamworth shot and killed his steward, Mr. Johnson, in a furious drunken rage. He immediately regretted it and offered to pay off the poor man's family. But to his great surprise, he was captured by his tenantry, was tried by his peers in the House of Lords, sentenced to death, and hanged at Tyburn in the presence of an immense concourse of people. The spectators, struck by the novelty of seeing a peer of Great Britain suffering like a common malefactor for taking the life of one of their own class, watched the whole extraordinary affair with respectful silence mingled with pity. He was hanged with a hempen rope, an ordinary hempen rope, and not with a silken one, as was his right. All over Europe, the execution of Lord Ferrers for the murder of a commoner was taken as a striking proof of the existence in England of judicial impartiality and the rule of law. But Sir Horace, who was in close contact with only one section of society, wrote to Walpole that the Florentine nobles were unable to believe that any crime could make a nobleman equal to a plebeian, but that some few, however, there are of a lower class who think that this event does great honor to our nation, and they envy a people where justice makes no distinction of persons. He seems to hold up the thought as with a pair of tongs. The year of the execution of Ferrers was also the year of the taking of Montreal and of the publication of Lawrence Sterne's wittily inconsequential novel, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. Horace Mann wrote to Horace Walpole, "These particulars of the taking of Montreal I read with an audible voice to a crowd of English who were come in upon the arrival of the post, and each testified his joy in a manner most suitable to his character. You will laugh at me, I suppose, when I say that I do not understand Tristram Shandy, because it was probably the intention of the author that nobody should." Earlier, Mann had failed to see the point of Alexander Pope's satirical poem, The Dunciad, but it is not necessarily a sign of Mann's obtuseness that he did not take to Tristram Shandy. After all, Dr. Johnson thought the book odd and pronounced, "Nothing odd will do long, Tristram Shandy did not last." One of Sir Horace's best English friends in Florence was George Clavering Cooper, 3rd Earl Cooper, who arrived in 1764 on his grand tour. At that time, he was known by his courtesy title, Lord Fordwich, and so was called by the Florentines, Mi Lord Forbici, or Lord Scissors. After succeeding to his father's title, he acquired the splendid Villa Palmieri and remained in Florence for 25 years. Lord Cooper was not only a collector, commissioning pictures, for example, from Anton Raphael Mengs, whom he met in Rome, but was also a patron of science. He corresponded with Alessandro Volta, after whom vaults are named, and he was made a member of the Florentine Academy. He was instrumental in having the monument to Machiavelli installed in Santa Croce. Cooper loved music, and he had his own private orchestra at the Villa Palmieri. From the painter Zoffini, Cooper bought Raphael's lovely Niccolini Madonna, now in the National Gallery in Washington. It's signed and dated 1508 and is surely one of the artist's happiest inventions. In 1774, Lord Cooper met the pretty 15-year-old Hannah Gore, who was in Florence with her parents at the Villa del Cipresso. He fell in love with her, followed the family to Rome, and pestered them into allowing him to marry her privately in Florence the following year. To his cousin, he had written, "They are the worthiest people I know. The youngest of the daughters I like very much. I hear they have £50,000 apiece, which would do very well." In this picture, painted by Zoffini in 1775, now in the Paul Mellon collection, we see Cooper gazing lovingly at Hannah, who is standing beneath a painting of a wedding ceremony in the temple of Hymen, the Hellenistic goddess of marriage, and is about to burst into song. Her sister Emily plays on a square pianoforte, while her father, Charles Gore, plays the cello. And to the right, we see her mother and her elder sister, Elizabeth. Hannah bore Lord Cooper 3 sons, but the marriage soon became the focus of Anglo-Florentine gossip, one of the most poisonous in all of Europe. Horace Mann no doubt sounded as though he was protesting too much when he insisted to the gossipy Horace Walpole that the Earl and Countess of Cooper live on the best terms together. Thomas Pelham noted that the invidious and scandalous Florentines supposed Lady Cooper's intimacy at the palace to be criminal. And indeed, Lord Cooper's appointment as Prince of the Holy Roman Empire was widely regarded as compensation for his wife's liaison with the Grand Duke, Pietro Leopoldo. "She is the most beautiful woman I ever saw," wrote Thomas Brand in 1784. But he added that she was proud and capricious, and almost all the travelers of this season are disgusted with her. And I should perhaps say that the word disgusted was much milder then than it is now. Something like they disapproved of her. After her husband's death, Hannah stayed on in Italy, seeing a good deal of her sister Emily until her death in 1824. She is buried in Leghorn. Grand tourists continued to arrive in Florence, generally accompanied by a traveling tutor or bear leader. In the mid-1760s, a bear leader named William Patoun wrote an interesting manuscript entitled Advice on Travel in Italy, addressed to some unidentified noble patron. On the subject of accommodation in Florence, he has this to say: "There are 2 great lodging houses in Florence where the English usually go to, Vanini's and Charles's, both equally good in all respects. Mrs. Vanini is an Englishwoman. Charles is protected greatly by Sir Horace Mann. The price of every article being fixed, you will not be imposed on in any respect. Your lordship will find the utmost attention paid to you by Sir Horace Mann. As your lordship will by this time be pratico del paese, I can say little relating to Florence that could be of material service. I need still less caution your lordship against the contagion of indolence and dangling after the ladies, which prevails more in Florence than anywhere else." And he takes the opportunity of warning his impressionable charges against poor old Patch. A certain Mr. Patch at Florence is the Second inn referred to, Charles's, the one Gibbon had stayed in, was on what is now the Lungano Guicciardini and was run by an agreeable Irishman from Manchester called Charles Hatfield or Hadfield. Horace Mann especially recommended this inn, which was furnished in the English manner, as Hatfield was a convivial host. He's shown holding aloft a bowl of steaming punch in one of Thomas Patch's pictures, The Punch Party. Unfortunately, poor Hatfield suffered a series of disasters when 3 of his beautiful red-haired children were murdered by an insane nurse. The other inn that William Patoun mentions was the Hotel Il Carraio and was run by Mrs. Maria Vanini. It was known as Widow Vanini's English Inn, and it was only a little way downstream from Charles's, in what was then Piazza Soderini and is now Piazza Nazario Sauro. The Scottish novelist Tobias Smollett stayed there in 1765 and again in 1770 while he was working on his amusing scatological novel, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker. Smollett found it convenient to stay at Widow Vanini's, as he was able to pay frequent visits to Horace Mann round the corner in Via Santo Spirito. It was Smollett who made the gnomic observation, some men are wise and some are otherwise. George Orwell called him Scotland's best novelist. Smollett thought Italian women the most haughty, insolent, capricious, and revengeful females on the face of the earth. And he said he would rather be condemned for life to the galleys than exercise the office of Cicisbeo. In June 1764, Edward Gibbon arrived here with his friend William Guise on their grand tour. Guise was a cousin of Horace Mann's. By the road of Bologna and the Apennine, I at last reached Florence, where I reposed from June to September during the heat of the summer months. At home, I had taken lessons of Italian. On the spot, I read with a learned native the classics of the Tuscan idiom. But the shortness of my time and the use of the French language prevented my acquiring any facility in speaking, and I was a silent spectator in the conversations of our envoy, Sir Horace Mann, whose most serious business was that of entertaining the English at his hospitable table. In another place, Gibbon gives a more circumstantial account of his arrival here. We had been so badly provided with horses that we did not reach Florence till 9 in the evening. We stopped at a certain Charles Hatfield's, an innkeeper well known among the English who speak very well of him. The next day, all the local English came to call on Gibbon. In the evening, we drove to the Porta San Gallo. It is the general and boring rendezvous of the Florentine nobility, who come there to take the air, or rather the dust. In a few days, they learned with the other English to prefer the Cascine, a fine meadow surrounded by trees. This is a view of the Arno seen from the Cascine by Thomas Patch. Sir Horace introduced the future historian to Florentine society, and Gibbon received many invitations from notables such as the Contessa Acciaioli and members of the Antinori family. In his usual obliging fashion, Mann secured tickets for Gibbon and Guise in the Regent's box for the famous riderless horse race along the Corso, held on the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul, and known as the Corsa dei Barbari. Gibbon relates that on hot evenings, parties were held in the courtyards of the Florentine palazzi, which were beautifully lit up and hung with tapestries. He paid no fewer than 14 visits to the Uffizi, studying the antiquities with minute care. In August, he and Guise went to call on Thomas Patch, who painted this view of the Arno, but it would be too much to expect Gibbon to share Patch's enthusiasm for early Florentine painting, and indeed he disapproved of the incorrect drawing of the primitives. After staying about 3 months, he pressed on to Rome, the decline and fall of whose empire he was later to chronicle at such enormous length. Of course, people still do come to Florence on their way to somewhere else, though they tend to stay here for very much less than 3 months, which seems a sensible amount of time to me. According to data, in 2016, the average tourist stayed in Florence for 2.61 nights, which is far too little. In August 1765, the Emperor Franz Stephen died, and within a month, his third son appeared in Florence as the new Grand Duke, Pietro Leopoldo, aged 18. Here he is with his brother, the new Emperor, Joseph II. In December this year, Mann was promoted from resident to envoy. When the old pretender died in 1766, all Mann's anxieties about the young pretender were revived. James had always been treated as the King of England in Rome. And at first, the reigning Pope, Clement XIII, seemed prepared to accord royal honors also to Charles. The French ambassador in Rome was all in favor of this. Mann pulled out all the stops and issued all sorts of diplomatic threats against Clement, who in the event decided, for his own reasons, not to support Charles's claim to the English throne. Mann insisted on taking all the credit for this development, which almost certainly had absolutely nothing to do with him. On 25th October 1768, Sir Horace was rewarded for his services by being invested with the Order of the Bath. This is an order of chivalry set up as recently as 1725 to reward people like Mann, high-ranking diplomats and army officers and so on. Pietro Leopoldo acted as George III's proxy at the ceremony, which Mann hastened to describe to Walpole. I have but lately time to acquaint you that the ceremony was performed by the great Duke on Friday last, etc. I gave a great dinner at 2 tables for all the English and the great officers of the court, and the next evening I gave a public ball to anybody who would come. Next Sunday, Lord Tilney gave a dinner still bigger, the best and most magnificent I ever saw, and so said those of the court who were there. He dressed all his upper servants in new lace clothes. And he describes how Lord Cooper put on a performance of Handel's Alexander's Feast for him in his villa, the Villa Palmieri. I mentioned Lord Tilney. John Child, 2nd Earl of Tilney, was one of Mann's best and most useful friends. He was effete and very rich and had been comfortably settled in Florence for 14 years in a house near the Carmine, which had a garden where he kept a great quantity of golden pheasants. This picture shows him with his English family. Like Mann, he was generous to the British visitors and allowed them to use his box at the theatre when he was away wintering in Naples. Lord Cooper remarked that Tilney's presence in Florence was a great resource to Mann, for Tilney was regarded as the leading member of the Anglo-Florentine community, even though it was said that his understanding was not bright. An unflattering vignette of Anglo-Florentine society and of Tilney's house at the Carmine is provided by another celebrated grand tourist, the languid and supercilious William Beckford. Beckford has just given a rapturous description of the Bobbly Gardens. He continues, "It was 6 o'clock and all the world was going to my Lord T.'s, who lives in a fine house all over blue and silver, with stuffed birds, alabaster cupids, and 1,000 prettinesses more. But after all, neither he nor his abode are worth mentioning. I found a deal of slopping and sipping of tea going forward, and many dawdlers assembled." In May 1769, the cardinals elected Giovanni Vincenzo Ganganelli, a Franciscan, as Pope Clement XIV. Writing to Walpole, Mann greatly exaggerated the new pope's proletarian origins. In February 1771, Mann wrote to Walpole about his friend Thomas Patch, rather hoping that the hypercritical Horace would share his high opinion of Patch's work. I am glad you like Patch's performance. He is really a genius, and all his productions have merit. He left Rome many years ago on account of some indiscretion about religion. Well, here, Mann is putting a somewhat generic construction on Patch's troubles with the Roman authorities. I took much to him, and though he does not live in my house, he is never out of it a whole day. He has an excellent turn for caricature. Here we see Patch's picture of the famous Shakespearean actor David Garrick in Via Santo Spirito on his grand tour. Mann goes on, he was always an adorer of the heads of Masaccio in the Carmine, and both drew them and engraved them himself. And well, he did it in time, for about a fortnight ago, the church was almost consumed by fire, and those paintings so damaged that I believe none remain entire. Well, luckily, this is quite untrue. That year, Mann received a visit from King George III's youngest brother, Prince William Henry, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh. He stayed at Charles's, accompanied by his secret wife, Lady Waldegrave, who was not yet acknowledged as being married to him. It was he, rather than his brother, the king, who once remarked to Edward Gibbon, another damned thick square book, always scribble, 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 eh, Mr. Gibbon? In the following year, 1772, the German-born artist Johann Zoffany arrived in Florence from London with a commission to paint a picture of the Grand Ducal collections for King George III and Queen Charlotte. The royal couple had heard a great deal about the Grand Tour and Florence and were very sorry that they would never be able to make the journey themselves. George was far too busy, and Charlotte had sworn she would never again put to sea after her storm-tossed voyage to England when she nearly drowned. Apple Charlotte is apparently named after her, but there's no basis for the persistent rumor that she had black ancestry. They admired Zoffany's carefully detailed interiors and hoped that he would paint for them a view of the Tribuna in the Uffizi, showing some of the Grand Duke's finest works of art. The proposed fee was £300. That's well over 50,000 in modern money. Zoffany arrived with royal letters of introduction and immediately set about rearranging the Tribuna to suit his taste, having various pictures and pieces of sculpture brought across the river from Palazzo Pitti and generally making a nuisance of himself. He received every assistance from Sir Horace Mann and Lord Cooper and Thomas Patch, and he put them all into his painting, together with a great many English tourists who happened to be in Florence at the time. There are some interesting remarks about the creation of this picture in the letters of a young grand tourist, fresh from Eton and Christchurch, George Finch, 9th Earl of Winchelsea. Early in 1773, he wrote to his mother, Lady Charlotte Finch, I go every morning into the gallery, which I admire more and more. I believe it is allowed to be one of the finest things in the world. The Tribune in particular is the most charming thing I ever saw. It is that Zoffany is drawing the picture of, which is really one of the most laborious undertakings I ever saw. For he not only copies a great many pictures and statues in the room, which is a great deal to do, but even the frames and the small bronzes, the table, etc. Lord Winchelsea reported with great delight to his mother that Zoffany asked me to be in it, which I am accordingly to be, and have sat once already. You can see him on the right, to the left of the little group admiring the statue of the Venus de Medici, his head just above Thomas Patch's. We note that Patch is pointing with his left hand to the buttocks of one of the wrestlers, the artist's little joke. Zoffany's painting of the Tribuna, now in the Royal Collections in London, is an iconic image that is emblematic of the Grand Tour, and a striking and beautiful picture. So it comes as a surprise to learn that King George and Queen Charlotte, who awarded the commission to Zoffany, absolutely hated it. They were furious with the German artist for cluttering up the Tribuna with non-entities whom they had never met and never heard of. They banished the picture from their presence. By the way, young Lord Winchelsea commented on Horace Mann's valetudinarianism. I believe I never saw so fiddle-faddle a man. I believe he thinks of nothing else but his health from one end of the week to the other. In February 1775, the cardinals elected Gianangelo Braschi as Pope Pius VI. I'm showing you this particular portrait of him because I wanted to include at least one painting by Pompeo Battoni, who painted so many excellent portraits of English grand tourists, though not ones with any connection to Florence. In January 1782, Mann was at last appointed envoy extraordinary and minister plenipotentiary to the Tuscan court. In April that year, he wrote to tell Walpole about the sad demise of Patch, having evidently forgotten that he had already told Walpole all about him. I have been employed in a very melancholy scene, that of assisting a very worthy man who was most friendly attached to me, Mr. Patch, of whom you may have heard my nephew speak. He was attacked yesterday morning with an apoplexy in my house, but finding himself ill, he went across the street to his own house and threw himself upon his bed. I was sent for, but found him speechless. He languished for a few hours and expired this morning. Patch was only 57. The nephew he mentions is Horace Mann the Younger, who saw quite a lot of Walpole in London. In this picture, we can see Lord Tilney, whose understanding was not very bright, sitting down and wearing a plum-colored suit. In August, Mann wrote to Walpole, "We have had the most deplorably wet summer that ever I remember, after 3 hotter than any in my memory. But I may as well finish when I have nothing better to talk of than the weather. It shows what a retired and insipid mortal I am. Adieu, my dear sir. Shall we not be very venerable in the annals of friendship? What Orestes and Pylades ever wrote to each other for 44 years without once meeting." These two cousins who had been raised together were the great example of male friendship in classical antiquity. Once he was nearly challenged to a duel by an Englishman whom he had omitted to invite to dinner. In 1784, Thomas Brand noted that old Sir Horace still winks his paralytic eye and repeats his wonted stories. But by the following year, Mann was looking sick and old, according to Mrs. Piozzi. She was the former Hester Thrale, great friend of Dr. Johnson, who had married an Italian violinist named Gabriele Mario Piozzi and had settled in Florence in what is now Piazza Goldoni. In March 1787, when he was over 80, Mann was feeling distinctly sorry for himself and insufficiently appreciated by the grand tourists and by his superiors in Whitehall. A note of petulance creeps into his final letters. I will not risk the conflux of English that after the Holy Week at Rome will flock to Florence. I know my countrymen. They enjoy the benefit of your hospitality and laugh at you for its exertions. If therefore government will not give me the salary, I will act the minister no longer and give the English an opportunity of sneering at a man who, to support a character he has not, lavishes his private fortune. This year was his last. Horace Mann the Younger came to Florence to assist his dying uncle and sent many pitiful bulletins to Walpole as the end drew near. It came on the 6th of November. The funeral was conducted by the Anglican chaplain at Leghorn, but the body was shipped back to England for interment at Linton, beneath a monument designed most suitably by Horace Walpole. It was noted that Florence is a dull town, no society for English since the death of Sir H. Mann. I'm showing you an allegory of time and truth painted by Annibale Carracci around 1584 and now at Hampton Court. I shall now try and put Mann's life into context. Was it at all important as lives go? My theory, easier to describe than to substantiate, is that Sir Horace did indeed have great historical importance, at any rate within the narrow field of Anglo-Florentine relations and the history of the British community in Florence. His kindness to visitors, admittedly once from a very restricted section of society, over a period of half a century, made Florence seem a very attractive destination to prospective travelers. Italian historians and continental European historians in general are likely to take a broadly determinist view of history, whether of the religious kind that sees the guidance of divine providence in human affairs, or more likely of the Marxist kind, with its emphasis on structure and the longue durée, its denial of human agency, and its deprecation of the significance of events, which Fernand Braudel memorably called surface disturbances, crests of foam that the tides of history carry on their strong backs. In contrast to this continental approach, British and American historians have been more willing to give weight to accident and contingency, and thus to the power of the individual to influence events and to create preconditions. It would possibly seem far-fetched and ingenuous to a doctrinaire Marxist or a member of the Annales school of scientific historians, but my theory is that Sir Horace's well-attested kindness to grand tourists made them much less likely to linger in Venice or to press on to Rome and Naples than they might otherwise have been, and that the consequent grand tourist presence in Florence, until the time when the Napoleonic Wars made continental travel impossible, created a climate of feeling in England, fostered by published accounts and by the works of art carried across the Alps to Britain, that made Florence seem a highly desirable destination, not just as a place to visit, but as a place in which to settle. So that when travel resumed after the fall of Napoleon and the re-establishment of peace at the Congress of Vienna, the new kinds of travelers, who later included the middle-class clients of Thomas Cook's organized tours, headed straight for Florence. Short-term visitors came in increasing numbers, and so did long-term visitors, those who decided to settle here permanently, attracted by the strong magnets of agreeable climate, comparative sexual freedom, beautiful paintings and sculptures and architecture, and a low cost of living. A comprehensive history of the British community in Florence, which would tell the story of the Macquarie banking family, of Robert and Elizabeth Browning and Walter Savage Landor, of Janet Ross and Ouida and Vernon Lee, of D.H. Lawrence, Norman Douglas and Reggie Turner, of our own British Institute and its directors Harold Goad, Francis Toy and Ian Greenlees, of Violet Trefusis and Harold Acton and John Pope Hennessy. A comprehensive history, I say, has yet to be written. No doubt its first chapter would have to concentrate on Sir Horace Mann. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Now, does anybody on the either in presenter or on Zoom have any questions? Yeah, sorry, yes. Michael. Yeah, I think he had.
I can't hear.
Yes, I think he was. He had good contacts with the Florentine nobility, and he certainly was in close contact with the Grand Duke. Politically, it's not to me very clear how active he was. As I said, he didn't pay any attention to the Illuministi in Florence, which was quite an omission, because that was an important component of Florentine culture. Please.
Please repeat the question.
Michael wasn't here, so can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, Michael's question was about Mann's engagement with politics. Does anyone else have a question in the room?
Thank you for a delightful talk. You talked about the influence of England on Italy and a bit on Italy on England. I know that Edward Gibbon, when he toured Italy, had not yet chosen a goal in life. And the tour of Italy inspired him to begin the lifetime work of the Decline and Fall.
Yeah, I believe he was considering writing a history of Switzerland, wasn't he? Then he got diverted by his visit to Rome.
Do you, from your research, do you have any insight into the experiences through Italy, whether in Florence or elsewhere, that caused him to take on such a major task?
Well, as I say, I think that he was so impressed by his visit to the Capitol in Rome, where he heard the barefoot friars chanting in the Temple of Jupiter. You remember that? It was like an epiphany, and it brought into his mind the idea of narrating the decline and fall of the city that he was then in. Please.
Thank you for a really very interesting talk. And I wondered about the Grand Tour was also a huge shopping trip for the participants. And I wondered how that tied in with people like Thomas Mann. They must have arrived with letters of introduction. And did he then introduce them to prospective artists?
Yes, he did.
Allow them. And do you think
he acted as an intermediary, and he helped people acquire statues and paintings.
So the part of his legacy
paintings himself. Walter Savage Landor bought 3 paintings that had previously been owned by Horace Mann.
I see. So part of his legacy, in fact, is quite a wealth of art that is in Britain at the moment.
Yes. Are there any questions from the Zoom audience? No. What's that? You have to unmute yourself.
Ah, can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes. Well, I could hear you.
Oh gosh.
It's Mr. Rawlinson. Could you
Yes.
unmute yourself, please?
Right. Trying to do it.
Yes, yes.
We can hear him. No, that's muted.
No,
I'm afraid I can't hear you. You need to be able to lip read.
Can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, Edward.
Well, I think Ivor's thing indicates that he was muted, but we could hear him, I think. But anyway, if there, if you,
Is that any better now?
Yes.
right.
Yes. Oh, Mark, I just wondered whether you thought that Mann was gay.
Yes, I think so.
Right. And did it matter?
No,
No.
no. I mean, when they say that that Walpole's hold over him was perhaps sexual, it seems rather ludicrous in view of their 40-year separation. But I suppose that comment refers to the time when they actually were in Florence together.
Yes. He was very effeminate, wasn't he?
Very, yes. One of those quotations that I read out about his good behavior goes on to say that he was very effeminate, and he appeared to this speaker to have lost the manliness of the English and to have acquired the effeminacy of the Italian. I decided not to read that bit.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
On the subject of Gibbon, yeah, it's a bit retrospective, isn't it? This claiming that he was inspired. It's a long time later that he really got to started writing The Decline and Fall.
Sorry, you're talking about Gibbon, Edward.
Yeah, about Gibbon. But anyway, in connection with Gibbon, there's something very exciting happened. You mentioned Guise. The family seemed to pronounce him Guys, but I tried to find the diaries of Guys which complement Gibbon's about 25 years ago. But someone has finally found them in the attics of Elmore Court, where the Guys family live, and so they're going to be published. And there's lots of references to Horace Mann. This has just come up this week, actually, so it's quite exciting news.
Well, that's very exciting news. Thank you.
Because all we had to go on, you had to go on, I suppose, as well, was the excerpts in Bonnard's edition of Gibbon's Travels.
Yeah.
But now we've got the whole diary. So.
And do you know who's publishing it?
Yes, I do, but it's I think I haven't had permission from the person that's got them.
Right.
But anyway, and they seem to rather oddly pronounce it Guys rather than Guise, the family.
Look forward to reading that.
Yeah. Anyway, wonderful. I love your masterly summary of the importance of Mann's role.
Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yes, especially the anti-Marxist bit. Yes.
That's very encouraging. Now, any more questions from the room? Well, thank you. Thank you. Simon Gammel's asked me to mention again that if any of you on Zoom feel like making a contribution, you can do so through the website, and we'd be frightfully grateful. Anybody else? Well, I think we've gone on
Oh, look who it is.
time.
It's Felipe.
Yes, I feel we ought to wind this up. Because it's 20 past. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.